Let's wrap up 10.8 by looking at the concept of higher powers of I. Right now, by definition, we know that I is the square root of negative 1. And if I square both sides, I squared is negative 1. So what I mean by higher powers are what happens if I take it to the third power, right? Or to the fourth power, or to the fifth power, or to the 13th power, or the 22nd power, or the 83rd power. So how do I simplify those? And mathematically, you guys probably won't do a lot of this anywhere in your guys' reality, but I do like to present this because it's a nice way to review and kind of mess around, and we're going to see something. Remember what I mentioned about how these mathematically model things that are cyclic, and so kind of watch what happens here. So we already have the first two powers covered, right? Here's the first power. By definition, it's the square root of negative 1, and here's the second power. I squared is negative 1. So what about I cubed? Well, I cubed breaks up into I squared times I. And so we know I squared is negative 1, and we know that I, right, is the square root of negative 1 if you wanted to. And so what we're basically looking at is negative square root of negative 1, which is basically negative I. So I cubed is effectively equal to negative I. So there's the third power. What about the fourth power? Well, if we thought in terms of exponents, I to the fourth breaks up into I squared times I squared. Of course, what do we know about I squared? Well, this would be negative 1 times negative 1, and what we're equal to is 1. Alright, so we started off with I, we get a negative 1, we get a negative I, and then we get a positive 1. So what about I to the fifth, right? What's that higher power equal to? Well, if we broke down I to the fifth, this is I squared times I squared times I. And so we know this is negative 1. This is also negative 1. And how about I just keep that as I? A negative times a negative is a positive, so we're left with I. So it turns out that I to the fifth basically takes us right back to where we started. So kind of in order here, I is I squared turns into negative 1, I cubed turns into negative I to the fourth is positive 1, and I to the fifth is going to be I. So we started with I, and by the time we get to the fifth power, we're right back at I. So we've made a cycle, basically. So I think that's pretty amazing. I told you that the imaginary number mathematically models cycles very well, and it turns out that as we mess around with higher powers, we end up with a cycle. So kind of verifies what I told you. Of course, what would you expect I to the sixth to be? Well, if it keeps following this pattern, I expect it to be negative 1. Right? I to the seventh, if it keeps following this pattern, I expect it to be negative I. So we're basically going to be bouncing back and forth between I and negative 1 and 1. So there's 4 potential answers we're going to have here. So this is either plus or minus 1 or plus or minus I. That's what all of these are equal to. So we just got to figure out which one of these 4 is this equal to. All right? So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's take advantage of 2 very important ones. I squared is negative 1, and I to the fourth is positive 1. So if I can rewrite 13 in terms of fourth powers and second powers, then I'm basically bouncing around between negative 1 and 1, and that's pretty easy. So I to the 13th, well, that's I to the fourth, I to the fourth, I to the fourth times I. Right? Or you might want to write that as I to the fourth to the third power times I. And this is another reason why I kind of like to do this, is because notice I'm really messing around with powers and my laws of exponents. So you can say it this way, or you can write it as a power. Alright, so I to the fourth 3 times means this. Well, what is I to the fourth? We know it to be 1. What is 1 to the third power? It is 1. What is 1 times I? It's I. So what is I to the 13th equal to? It is equal to I. So out of our 4 choices, it comes out to positive I. So that's how you pretty much handle higher powers. Take advantage of I squared and I fourth to help you out along. I to the 22nd. Well, again, if we kind of think about this, we have I to the fourth, right? 22 is 20 plus 2. 20 is 4 times 5. So I basically have I to the fourth 5 times with an I squared basically remaining. That's what that basically tells us. Or if you want to literally write it out, right? We have I to the fourth, I to the fourth, I to the fourth, I to the fourth, times I squared. 4 plus 4 is 8, plus another 4 is 12, 16, 20, plus 2 is 22. But it's kind of better to write it that way, especially for what's coming. So I to the fourth is 1, I squared is negative 1, 1 to the fifth is 1, and we're multiplying it to negative 1. So what's our final answer? Negative 1. So I to the 22nd is the negative 1 choice. So that's what that turns out to be. And then last but not least, 83. Oh my goodness, right? That's a pretty big number. But if we think in terms of fours, right, what we're looking at here, this is 80 plus 3, right? And 80 is basically 4 times, make sure I get this right, 15. So we're looking at I to the fourth to the 15th power, and then we have an I cubed. So that effectively is 1. So it really comes down to figuring out what I to the third is. Well, either you memorized it or you just keep breaking that down, which is negative 1 times I. So we get negative I as our final answer. So I to the third is negative I as our answer. So we're just breaking things down into some nice things that we know. I to the fourth is probably the easiest because it's just 1. Use I squared when it's necessary. And that's how you handle higher powers of I. So it's a nice exercise of reviewing our exponents, reviewing some exponential rules, and then using some powers of I as we bounce back and forth and cycle through plus 1, minus 1, plus I, and minus I. So that wraps up Chapter 10. Again, as usual, if you need help, please reach out for it. Ask your questions on Canvas. There's a lot of good help there from myself or your classmates. Send me an email. Hopefully my math lab also has tons of help. I've opened up everything there. And then if you really need it, request a Google Meet. I haven't heard from a lot of you, so I'm assuming everything's fine. But if you need help, please email me. Let's set up a Google Meet time and let's get you through. We're almost done. Actually just a week away. So talk to you guys later.